Have you ever learned something for the first time and then it suddenly seemed to appear everywhere? For instance, maybe you learn a new word and then you start to hear it in conversations, podcasts, social media posts. Or maybe you buy a particular type of car and now it feels as though that exact model has become much more common on the road. Experiences like this can feel like the world has changed overnight. But in reality, the environment has remained the same. What has changed is your awareness. Psychologists refer to this experience as the Bodher-Meinhof phenomenon, or more commonly referred to as the frequency illusion. This illusion occurs when something you've recently become aware of begins to stand out repeatedly, creating the impression that it's happening much more often than it actually is. Understanding this concept is important because it reveals how our brains filter information and shapes the way we interpret our everyday experiences. Today, I will explain what the frequency illusion is, how it can be observed in daily life, and the mental processes that cause it. To begin, let's take a closer look at what the frequency illusion actually involves. The frequency illusion happens when new knowledge or awareness makes certain details in our environment suddenly more noticeable. Even though those details were always present, they have now seemed to appear more frequently. Cognitive linguist Arnold Zwicky of Stanford University considers this an illusion because the increase we perceive is not real. Instead, it is a result of heightened attention and awareness, not actual change. The term itself has an interesting origin. In 1994, a reader wrote to the St. Paul Pioneer Press newspaper, explaining that after learning about a German militant organization known as the Bodher-Meinhof Group, he encountered several references to it within a short period. Now, this coincidence stood out so strongly that it eventually became associated with this type of mental experience. Arnold Zwicky later helped popularize the term frequency illusion, explaining that it reflects how our brains misinterpret patterns and information. Since then, the phrase has been widely used to describe those moments when something new suddenly seems to appear everywhere. But to really understand this concept, let's move on to my second point and look at how it appears in everyday life. The frequency illusion is something that almost everyone experiences, often even without realizing it. One of the most common examples involves language, as in where we learn a new vocabulary word. At first, it feels unfamiliar, but then within the next few days, you start hearing it in conversations or seeing it in articles, even noticing it in movies or music. We might think, man, this word has become awfully popular since last Tuesday. Another example happens with consumer products. After purchasing a new phone or pair of shoes, people often begin noticing that same item everywhere they go. Students also experience this effect when studying. After learning a new concept in class for the first time, they begin to notice it in other subjects, media, discussions, or even other courses. I personally experienced this after learning about the frequency illusion. Once I understood this concept, I started seeing it referenced in articles and even hearing people talk about it in conversations about psychology. It felt as though the idea had suddenly become much more common, when in fact it had simply become more relevant to me. In each of these cases, nothing in the external world has changed. The only difference is that the information has become personally meaningful, which makes it stand out. So this leads to an important question and my final point. Why does this happen? The frequency illusion is not random. It can be explained by the way our brains process and filter information. According to Zwicky, the phenomenon is primarily driven by two key psychological mechanisms: selective attention and confirmation bias. Let's start with selective attention. The human brain is constantly receiving an overwhelming amount of sensory information, far more than it can fully process. According to psychology writer Kendra Cherry, we are exposed to countless sights, sounds, and details every second, but can only process a small portion of it consciously. Because of this, the brain must filter information and prioritize what seems important. When something becomes meaningful to us, like a new word, idea, or product, our brains begin to prioritize it. As a result, we start noticing it more often, even though it was always present. In other words, the object isn't increasing in appearance, our brains are increasing in recognition. Now let's look at the second factor, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias refers to our natural tendency to notice and remember information that supports what we already believe, while ignoring information that doesn't. Psychologist Raymond Nickerson explains in the journal Review of General Psychology that people are more likely to focus on evidence that confirms their expectation and overlook evidence that contradicts them. In the case of the frequency illusion, once we notice something a few times, we begin to expect it to appear everywhere. Each additional sighting reinforces that belief, making it seem like the frequency is increasing. For example, if you notice a specific car model twice in a day, you might start thinking, wow, I'm seeing this everywhere. Then each time you spot it again, it confirms your impression, even though you ignore all the other cars that pass. Selective attention makes you notice the item more, and confirmation bias makes those observations feel relevant and frequent. Together, these processes create the powerful illusion that something has become much more common. At this point, you might be wondering, why should this matter to me? The frequency illusion is much more than just an interesting mental trick. It provides important insight into how human perception works. It shows us that our brains do not passively observe reality. Instead, it actually filters, prioritizes, and interprets information. This means that what we notice and what we think is happening is not always an accurate reflection on reality. Understanding this can help us become much more aware of our own thinking. For example, it can help us avoid jumping to conclusions based on limited observations. Just because something seems more common doesn't mean that it actually is. It can also help us think more critically about patterns that we believe that we see, whether in everyday life, social trends, even the news and information. Recognizing the role of selective attention and confirmation bias allows us to question our assumptions and make much more informed judgments. In a world filled with constant information, the awareness is incredibly valuable. So in conclusion, the frequency illusion offers a fascinating look into how the human mind works. We've explored what the phenomenon is, how it appears in daily life, and the psychological mechanisms that cause it. By understanding this illusion, we can become more mindful about how we interpret the world around us. So if you're hearing about the frequency illusion for the first time today, don't be surprised if you start seeing it again very soon. And when you do, take a moment to ask yourself, did the world really change? Or is my brain experiencing the frequency illusion?